23 years later, we're graced with a remake and slight reimagining of Final Fantasy VII, the seminal game from Square Enix. And to talk about this release today on PS4 and PS4 Pro, I'm joined by my friend and colleague John Linneman, who's also working on a special piece of his own for Final Fantasy VII. How you doing there, John?
I'm doing pretty good, Alex. So yes, we're taking a look at the remake today, but I also have something in the works for DF Retro, which will come sometime later this week, hopefully. So
that's exciting.
Look forward to that. It's going to be epic. But for now, we're here to talk exclusively about the new version of the game, which I think we've both been playing.
Yeah, and it really comes out of the gate swinging, as I would say. This game, when I first played the demo back not too long ago, really, really impressed me with its usage of Unreal Engine 4, and especially with the way it starts off with how its cutscenes are done, which is obviously completely different than the original game, where there's tons of motion blur in the cutscenes and extensive use of bokeh depth of field. And it makes it feel essentially like the Final Fantasy VII Advent Children movie, except honestly better looking in a lot of aspects.
Yeah, you're completely right. Especially that first chapter, that whole introduction sequence is remarkable to behold. It's kind of amazing that we've reached this point in real-time 3D rendering, and not just in terms of any single element, it's how it all comes together. It's everything from the animation, the camera work, the effects work, the materials quality, like it's all unbelievable. And yes, Advent Children probably still has some advantages in terms of, like, say, raw polygon count, because it's an offline CGI film. But when you look at the materials and just like the general way everything is shaded and lit in that movie, I kind of think this looks better.
Yeah, I'd agree. And it also does some really snazzy things, like how it transitions from that initial opening full motion video, like pre-rendered file, directly into the real-time rendered segment where Cloud jumps off the train and engages in combat with these security dudes. That is really smoothly done, and you can basically not even tell when the transition occurs. The game does this multiple times throughout the story, where sometimes it does a flashback sequence to some memory that Cloud has or something like that, and it plays an FMV video at that moment, but at that time you cannot even tell that it's transitioning usually. It's a really smart usage.
Which is a nice throwback, actually, because I'll discuss in another video, but that was kind of something that they used a lot in the original game. So I appreciate them weaving FMV sequences so seamlessly together. It's something we haven't seen in a modern game, I think, quite like this since Lost Odyssey for Xbox 360, which very memorable introduction where it goes from the CGI to the in-game just perfectly.
This game does it too a lot, where a cutscene starts and you don't even notice that it's going to be switching over to gameplay, and the camera pans around to right behind Cloud. I really, really like that. Obviously, the thing that's enabling this is Unreal Engine 4, which is obviously slightly new for Square Enix because they usually work with their own tools and engines, but here they're using the middleware Unreal Engine 4, and they're doing it to a really great effect and using all those things that we've come to know from Unreal Engine 4, like relatively high quality ambient occlusion, bloom, GPU particle effects, which are kind of flying around everywhere in combat in this game. And I chose to play the game with the real-time combat option, but just really enjoying the spectacle of all the explosions that are occurring while this is happening. And another thing that obviously gets from that is the motion blur, which I'm really proud of how this game handles it. In cutscenes, it's full motion blur, basically, camera and a per object motion blur, which makes essentially these 30 FPS cutscenes look so smooth.
Oh yeah.
In gameplay, they turn off the camera motion blur, but keep the per object blur on with a very, I would say, long shutter speed. So it looks so good.
This is so key, and I feel like they've done a great job at understanding what people dislike about motion blur. And it is that when you have camera motion where moving the camera blurs the whole screen, I can understand that, and that doesn't always work. And so they've basically used motion blur in the most optimal way possible. It improves the cinematics, it looks great on objects, but it doesn't blur your camera when you look around.
The animations in-game here while you're in combat are really smooth in general, and them looking that much smoother with the per-object blur is something that's really great. And another kind of post-process that they're using from Unreal Engine 4, obviously, is the Temporal Anti-Aliasing, which on the PS4 Pro that I was playing on does a pretty darn good job of keeping the presentation looking, I would say, decidedly CG-like. It's a little bit soft. technically because it's TAA, but at the targeted 1620p resolution that I saw on PS4 Pro, it generally looks really awesome. Only an occasional problem, like I noticed in the demo, where certain shadows would have ghosting in them when you move around. And also technically, because the way Unreal Engine 4 does its hair rendering, it actually dithers it at a lower resolution and hopes that TAA will clean it up. That makes the hair on a character like Cloud, sometimes when he's a little bit further away from the camera, kind of break up a little bit. And that happens technically with a number of the transparency textures used in the game, which are stochastic. And then if you get really close, you can see that they're actually like stippled. But other than that, I think it's one of the better uses of Unreal Engine 4 to kind of achieve an artistic vision that we've seen this generation. It looks really good.
Yeah, and it is interesting to contrast to what they did with their own engine. I guess it was the Luminous Studio stuff they did for Final Fantasy 15, which still looks tremendous. Absolutely gorgeous game with its lighting model and everything, but it didn't quite have the same suite of post-process effects that you get with Unreal, so that you didn't get this fancy motion blur in its original form or anything like that. So things like hair really stood out as being somewhat artifacty, and it's still the case here, but it's cleaned up enough where I didn't find it overly distracting.
Yeah, the resolution's good, I thought, on PS4 Pro. And a big difference between Final Fantasy 15 and this game is that it mixes dynamic lighting and baked lighting at the same time, whereas Final Fantasy 15 was like a real-time time of day, excluding certain missions, obviously, and kind of a real-time global illumination system. Here, most of the direct lighting, I would say, is done with dynamic lights, but there's occasionally like a couple of baked shadows here or there that you'll see around the world, probably to just increase performance. But all the indirect lighting in this game is done through baked light maps, as far as I can tell. So this really great scene, like in the church here, you can see this awesome kind of really high fidelity baked bounce lighting going everywhere from the outside sky, and it looks really great.
I think it makes perfect sense. They made a good choice there in that, real-time indirect lighting isn't necessarily required in all instances.
No.
It's a nice to have, but for a game where specific times of days are set at a fixed point, where they're going for a certain artistic vision, it makes a lot of sense because obviously, like you say, you save a lot on performance since that sort of lighting is rather expensive. Talking about that, another thing that's interesting is the environment quality, and this is a little bit mixed, but let's start at the top from the very beginning. I think the introduction mission specifically, and most of that town that you wander around in after you initially escape from the reactor, I thought all of that looked really, really good. It has that same density of frame where I think it's like a big picture kind of game where when you're wandering down the streets or through the reactor, your senses basically suggest that there's just a lot of detail in your periphery. So it really feels very carefully crafted.
Yeah, the first mission and that initial scene after you get out of the reactor are very dense. And in those scenes, when you get close to some object, I was surprised at the detail you'd see, like the bricks on the wall in the opening mission. When you get close to them, you'll see that actually like it's a number of modeled bricks, not like using tessellation or parallax occlusion mapping or something like that, but just real modeled bricks. Or you can see that on the ground, like here, or like when you walk by the train, has a lot of really great material work and a lot of great detail that, combined with that kind of feeling that you're talking about, John, gives you a feeling like that this world is actually rather large. Later in the game, it'll change a little bit depending upon what area you're in. Like I said at the initial part of this video, the opening part of the game is really highly impressive. And one thing that made it almost more impressive was how well it ran while looking this good generally. Even in combat, I played on the PS4 Pro, which looks to be using a 1620p dynamic resolution, with it rather often sticking to that upper bound resolution of 1620p. Only in combat and like areas where there's a lot of particle effects or a lot of explosions going on did I count at its lowest a 1368p in what was probably the most strenuous area of the game so far. But while it's doing that and dropping resolution, I did not see any frame drops really throughout my entire play. I have 10 hours of recorded play on the PS4 Pro and found 5 instances of frame drops, and they were all 1 or 2, 3 frames dropping with immediately recovering back to the target 30 FPS.
That's really impressive. Again, that stability that you get there, that actually kind of makes this part of the analysis somewhat less interesting in that
yeah,
it's kind of not good for our discussion per se, but it is actually good for the end user because, you can actually rely on a smooth, stable 30 frames per second. And I think we saw pretty much the same on the base PS4 as well.
Yeah, essentially there there, it's targeting 1920 by 1080, so 1080p with, I'm assuming, a similar dynamic resolution setup. But in those same scenes where I counted something like 1368p on the PS4 Pro, as a lot of crazy stuff is happening, by the way, the PS4 was actually not dropping resolution at all here. I was still getting 1920 by 1080 counts. So it may drop resolution, but I have yet to see it. And if it does happen, it's so exceedingly rare and not obvious that I didn't notice it. Then again, it may of course happen. And the PS4 also performed really well with just an occasional dip below 30 for one frame and then a quick spike up to 16 milliseconds that you could see occasionally when entering combat for the first time or something like that, or when a new cutscene area would load. But in general, it ran nearly as well as the PlayStation 4 Pro. And these drops were basically inconsequential.
Yes. Unfortunately, this is the part of the discussion where I guess things get a little bit weird.
Yeah.
So the game does look amazing at times, or, a good percentage of the time. But I think we both started to notice pretty early on that things are not entirely perfect, specifically with the textures.
Yeah, there's one thing first, that when you get past the first area of the game, which I think is really wonderful looking, like the reactor section and that initial town area when you get out of the reactor, then you get to the first slum section, and that is where the game's, I would say, overall texture resolution for many of the world objects just kind of seems like it was cranked down, almost like it was made under different constraints, either budgetary or maybe there's just not enough memory or something to go around to render these scenes with high resolution textures. When you get to this kind of slum town area, a lot of the textures when you're just standing there look weirdly low resolution. And I'm not sure if this is a bug or if it's some sort of other constraint on the game engine.
That's kind of the thing we've been discussing and are uncertain about, because there's certain key textures that show up very visibly in certain scenes. Like I think this cutscene here where you enter your apartment for the first time, and then, again in other points of the game, but you always see that door very visibly in the frame, right? And the texture never loads anything different than what it's there, so you get this very blurry, undefined looking thing like on the door. And it's baffling because if you go downstairs and look at the doors of the lower level of the apartment, they're all fine. So it's like, what's going on?
I don't know. And it shows up a number of times, like you'll get out of a cutscene and the first object you'll see out of a cutscene is like this weirdly low resolution thing right next to an extremely highly detailed character model. There's like a really imbalance in the art that starts happening in the game after you get through the first initial chapters. I would still say the missions inside the reactor areas still look really pretty good in terms of their texture resolution, but for some reason, like the towns, like you'll see here, some of this stuff along the side of the town right before you get to the second town of the game, all this trash and rubbish piles, is strangely low resolution where it almost looks like it has to not be right. Maybe it's because there's such a variety of unique textures in these town areas that they have to manage it more, I would say aggressively, what resolution they are, but it doesn't look right most of the time. And I think another problem that makes this even worse is that if you use the R2 button to run in the game, which I guess if you're going in between side quests or just trying to get anywhere quickly throughout these towns, when you run at that speed, the texture swapping in that occurs is it's a little bit more severe than you're probably used to seeing in many games. So you can like run around and then it'll stop for a second, and then you'll notice that some of the objects around you, their textures load in rather late. And sometimes this can happen on areas that you're supposed to go to anyway. So like when you return to the bar where Tifa works, or Tifa's bar essentially, you'll like run up to the stairs to go into the door, and then all of a sudden like the entire facade of the bar is still its low resolution texture. We initially heard about this from our colleague Aoife at Eurogamer, who was doing the usual review for the game that was not focusing on the technical aspects. So it occurred to her and she saw it as an issue even though she wasn't doing a technical review. And then I started seeing it in game, and both Aoife and myself were also using launch model PS4 Pros, so we assumed it was maybe coming from that we had older launch models that had hard drives that were not performing as well as they should nowadays. Richard Ledbetter tried it on his most recent launch, the 7200 version Pro. He also experienced the same thing using the internal HDD. And then he also tried it on an SSD, an external SSD on that same Pro model. It also showcased the same issue. It's just that the textures loaded in at a little bit faster rate. So you would still run up to textures and they would still be low res. They would just turn to the higher resolution textures a little bit faster. And on PS4, Tom Morgan testing that out, it had this exact same problem as the PS4 Pro with its internal HDD. So this is a weird one. I don't know how they'll necessarily fix the texture load-in problem, but I feel like the general lower resolution textures that you see that we talked about, like scattered throughout the world, where you're like, why is that so low res? I feel like that's not intended, unlike maybe the texture load-in.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing. It feels all too familiar since we saw some similar things with the recent Star Wars game.
Yeah, right.
From Respawn. Hey, this is an example of one case where the two new consoles would help a whole lot.
Yeah, more memory and a much faster streaming system. It does make the game look a little bit less even in terms of how great it looks, like with the initial chapter looking so great, and a lot of the cutscenes in the game also looking really amazing. It's just these strange town areas with low resolution textures and really obvious texture streaming that bring down that initial impression from being so high. But in the end, I think it's still a really great looking game, and the performance on both these systems, the PS4 and the PS4 Pro, is extremely impressive. And I really look forward to seeing what video you're working on, John, right now. But in the meantime, thanks for joining me.
Oh, but of course, always a pleasure.
And if you did like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. And if you want to see this video in the highest quality possible, support us on Patreon. If you want to talk to John or myself about Final Fantasy VII, please write a comment below or follow us on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex bidding you auf Wiedersehen und